Thank you, Wendy. Well, you've introduced me already, so I don't have to do that. Just a quick note about the Productivity Commission. I'm not sure, about 3 or 4 years old, so we're quite young still. 5 years, so time flies. Well, we're still quite young. 5 is still quite young. And we do a mixture of big inquiries and sort of independent economic research. And we're a little bit different. We're not a normal government agency. We're an independent Crown entity, so we're a little bit separate from sort of the day-to-days of government. So we can think about some of these bigger issues and that. Now, I've just got 5 minutes, which isn't a lot of time, but being from the Productivity Commission, I thought there's not a problem to be input constrained and have a limited amount of time. I just have to be as productive as possible. And so I've just got these 3 points, and on each point I've just got one piece of evidence. Now, I could have given you pages and pages, but I just decided to pick out what I thought were each of the 3 most interesting points in the 3 bits of evidence. And I guess the key is, and it's similar with the 2 earlier presentations, I've avoided the tendency to try and be prescriptive about what I think you should be recommending. I've just set out some sort of trends and some of the issues you need to think about. And I'd argue that the way that your prescriptions can address some of these concerns will be a measure of whether they're successful or not. Now, I was quite pleased in the last presentation because you were told to close your eyes and think ahead to 2056, I think. And luckily, my graph goes up to 2055. So we weren't coordinated, but it looks reasonably joined up. So this is, if you've thought about what New Zealand is going to look like in 2056, this is a couple of paths to get there. Now, I'll just quickly explain what this graph is. We call it a whale graph because if you could put a dot up there, it would look very much like a whale. But basically, what it is, it's a graph that shows what you have to do if you want to keep the government's debt to at 20% of GDP by 2055, the type of things you need to do to get there. So it illustrates one of the issues you've got to think about of fiscal sustainability. Now, obviously, the 20% figure, it's one that the government's committed to currently. It's not, there's no magic in that number. It could be a different figure. So just, these are just really illustrative paths. But basically, you can get there in 3 ways. You could either cut expenditure or increase taxes. You could increase productivity slowly, or you could increase productivity quickly. Now, what this graph doesn't show is what happens if you don't do anything. Now, if you don't do anything, basically the government's debt will go up to about, between 140 and 150% of GDP. So that's an issue. That's getting to the levels where your costs of borrowing are becoming quite high and your access to funds might be limited. So that's doing nothing isn't an option. So you really have to think about one of these 3 options. Now, the reduced expenditure growth isn't really an attractive option as well, because to get to that sort of dotted line there, what you'd have to do is you'd have to cut spending or increase taxes by about 7.2 billion every year for the next 40 years and sort of maintain it at that level. And to put that 7.2 billion figure in context, we spend about 10 billion on education currently. So that's asking quite a lot of future governments, isn't it? So basically, you then have to think, well, actually, we really do need to think about getting some productivity into the system. So we really do need to think about how we can lift productivity. Now, I should have explained what productivity is. I mean, really, productivity really is just a measure of how much output you can get for the inputs that you sort of put into a system. So your inputs can include things like your labour, your capital, those types of things. So how much resources you have available, and actually productivity is the ability of you to turn those resources into outputs. And outputs are important because they can contribute to the outcomes, which were those things that you were thinking about when you closed your eyes and you thought about New Zealand in 2056. You were really thinking about outcomes. What do we want New Zealand to look at? And productivity is a way to get there. Now, it's a strange concept, but there's a quote, and I've used this at a previous talk that I've given for Wendy, so you might have heard it before, but I like it, so I will repeat it. It's Ernest Rutherford, who was the Nobel Prize-winning New Zealand physicist, and his quote was, "We don't have the money, so we're going to have to think." And I just love that quote because, we don't have the money, so we're input constrained, so we don't have the money, or we may not have the workforce of larger countries, so we're going to have to think. So we're going to have to be smarter and think about how we lift our productivity. Again, this is a point that came up in some of the earlier presentations as well, around technology. I mean, the other thing you really need to be thinking about is technological change. And this is just a graph that I've taken from the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research, where they took some overseas work and they just applied it into a New Zealand context, just to illustrate the impact of technology that it's going to have on the labour market. Now, it's quite incredible, really. I mean, it was just the other day, there was a story in the Herald about someone driving across Auckland Harbour Bridge, and they took their hands off the wheel and, the car drove itself. In the UK, they're already testing convoys of trucks that are driving themselves. So a lot of this technology that Jeff was talking about, he was talking about the debate between the technological optimists and the technological pessimists. A lot of this technology is actually already becoming real. It's quite unbelievable, really. But if in the UK, for example, they've had driverless trains for years. The Docklands Light Rail in London, it's been driverless for a lot, sort of probably over a decade, maybe even longer. So some of this technology, and it's going to have massive impacts on the labour market. So I wouldn't want to be a truck driver. If I was like, I've got a young daughter, I'm going to tell her not to train to be a truck driver, because I don't see, there's probably not much future in being truck drivers. And there's a whole lot of these other jobs which are going to be replaced. Now you can say, well, that's terrible. What we should do is we should become technological pessimists. We should put the barriers up, and we should stop this sort of onset of technology. But it's also important to recognise that technology creates jobs as well. And actually the destruction of some jobs is actually not a new thing. Telephone operators, that used to be a large share of employment. Dishwashers, actually manual dishwashers used to be a large thing. A lot of these jobs have become automated. So that's just a fact of life. Now, in order to pick up on the debate between the technological optimists and the technological pessimists, this is a real issue. And as Jeff mentioned, there has been this stagnation or the slowdown in productivity growth. And so it's important to think about what that means. And at an aggregate level, yes, we are seeing a slowdown in productivity growth. But what's really interesting about this is if you actually look at individual firms, you see that the picture is a little bit different. And actually, there is a lot of innovation among frontier firms. So there is a small group of firms that are just as productive and as just as innovative as they've ever been. In fact, probably becoming more productive and innovative. But what's happening is that those lessons from those top firms or those frontier firms are not, being distributed more widely among the economy. So you're getting a breakdown on what we call diffusion. So the lessons from the best firms are not being picked up by the smaller firms, or the smaller firms, they're sort of existing and they're not having to lift their performance. So what does that mean for technology? I'm actually probably more of a technological optimist, because what that highlights is that there are actually opportunities for a lot of firms to actually pick up these technologies and to start making better use of technologies. And it's not just a question for firms as well. I mean, think about your public services like healthcare. Health is really interesting because it's one of these areas, it's a fascinating area to work in because there's so much technology driving so much change. If you go back a few years ago and you had a heart problem, I mean, basically your option was open heart surgery. So that, crack open your chest, and a sort of a highly paid surgeon will get in there and mess around with it. Hugely dangerous, very, very risky sort of operation for the patients. New surgery techniques have meant that it's become a lot safer. So rather than cracking open the chest, you can do keyhole surgery. So there's new ways of treating people. And even now, a lot of the time, people won't need surgery. So you can give people statins. So you can treat them with drugs. You can do testing and you can start treating them. So you're actually seeing technology fundamentally changing things like healthcare, the way that healthcare is provided. So we don't necessarily need the surgeons as much as we did. We can actually treat heart problems in different ways. So it's really quite an exciting change, but it's also quite challenging because it's actually going to be fundamentally disruptive. And then the final exhibit, and again this picks up on Jeff's point, is really about the demographic changes. And I've got here, I thought I'd appeal to a little bit of self-interest because I thought you might be curious to know how long Statistics New Zealand think you'll live. So for those of you who were born in between 1990 and 92, for example, females, when at birth you could have expected to have 78.7 years. So that's pretty good. If you look at now, you've still got, assuming you're 20, in 2012, 2014, you've got 63.8 years left. So your longevity, simply by the fact that you're a survivor, means that your longevity's increased, so you can expect another 63 years. But if you follow a particular cohort through, so say you pick the 1950 to 52 cohort, and I've just highlighted and read the female results. So a female born in 1950, say, at birth had a life expectancy of 71.3 years. By the time she was 20, it was 56.3, so that's 76.3 in total. And then by the time she was 40, it was up to, she had 40 more years left. And then by the time, at 65, she had 21.3 more years. So what's interesting though is if you compare that sort of those statistics for, say, the females born in 1950 with those born in 2012 to 14, and you can see actually quite a large increase in expected longevity. So you can see that actually someone who's born, I've got a young daughter, so she's in this group, so she can expect to live until 83.2. So that's good news for her. But it's fundamental, it's quite a crucial change for how we're thinking about policy settings in particular. And in previous work I've done, I worked out some of the implications of this. For example, there were 0.61 million people over 65 in 2012. By 2042, this will be 1.29 million. So that's a massive increase. That's a growth rate of 2.5%. in the over 65 population, which compares to overall population growth of 0.7%. So what we're seeing is that growth in the old population is going to be faster than the growth in the population as a whole. Now that's important to think about in terms of the labour market, because if you're actually getting a shrinking share of the population of working age, you have to think, well, actually, these people are going to have to be more productive because they're going to have to, sort of earn the money to pay the pensions for this sort of growing group of over 65. And even if you, now this is based on a horrific number of assumptions, this work, but if you assume that voting turnout rates don't change, and that's a key assumption, for every elector in 65 and 2010, there were 4.5 younger voters. So in 2010, for everyone who was voting over 65, there are 4.5 people who are younger than that voting. By 2050, this will fall to 2.3%. So not only will the labour force become older, but the voting population will become quite significantly older as well. Now, that's based on current voting turnout rates, and I want you to really think about that, because that's one assumption you could change, and that's actually a variable that we could change because there is quite low voting turnout among younger groups, so that's potentially something to change. If we've got this ageing population, I mean, it's not fixed in stone that the voting population will become so heavily skewed, because you could actually look at catalysing younger voters in different ways and doing other things. So, with all of these things, these are just trends. You still have choices. We still have choices that can shape how we get there. But it is important because it does highlight that the labour force is likely to shrink. And that's particularly important because if you look at New Zealand's history of growth, over the last few decades, it's largely been driven by working quite hard. We work quite long hours, we have quite high rates of labour utilisation. That strategy isn't going to be as successful going forward. And it's actually the same for public services as well. Statistics New Zealand have done some work on the health sector productivity, and between 1996 and 2014 there was 4% output in the health system. So over those years, on average, the amount of health that was provided actually increased by 4%, which is actually looking at the long-term fiscal pattern, you kind of need a 4% output growth in health going forward as well. So we need to keep driving that. But that was largely driven by labour input. So that was 2.9% labour input and only 1.1% from labour productivity. So 3 times as much of the output in health was coming from just actually more doctors, more nurses, just through increasing labour input rather than actually through increasing productivity. Now that strategy is not going to work when you've got an ageing population and you've got a shrinking labour force. So this is why we've got to think about productivity. Thank you.